بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Last week we spoke about the great Palestinian revolution, an organized jihad against the British and the Jewish occupiers, where the Palestinians organized themselves and they revolted against these occupiers. And this jihad started officially in the month of May in the year 1936 of the Gregorian calendar. So this went on for a few months, and the Palestinian forces were able to inflict a lot of damage and heavy casualties upon the enemy. Then in the month of October in the year 1936, so about 5 months into the revolution, Palestinian leadership paused the revolt. They basically declared a ceasefire, and that was based upon British promises to address the Palestinian demands. The British, they promised that, okay, just stop the revolt and we will address your concerns and we will give you what you are demanding. So the British, they promised this about 5 months into the revolution. So this was in the month of October of 1936, and the revolution was paused. Now the British, they were known for breaking promises, and they had broken many promises before this. But the Palestinians, the Arabs, they were not very politically savvy. So they believed these British promises once again. And because of that, they paused the revolution. So this ceasefire, or this pause of the great Palestinian revolution, lasted for about 1 year, for approximately 1 year. Then eventually, when the Palestinian forces realized that this matter was nothing more than once again a grand British deception, they resumed the jihad. But by that time they had lost some of their momentum, right? And the British, during that period of 1 year where there was no fighting, the British were secretly making their own plans and their own arrangements. But after about 1 year, the Palestinians, they realized that this was a deception once again on the part of the British. So they resumed the jihad after about 1 year of pause. And on September 26, 1937, the Qassam forces, this was one of the main contingents of the Palestinian jihad, the Qassam forces, they assassinated the British governor of Al-Jalil, who ruled the majority of the northern area. So the Qassam forces were able to assassinate this British governor of Al-Jalil. Also, Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, he remobilized his battalions as well. So there were two main forces in the Palestinian jihad. There were the Qassam forces and the forces of Abdul Qadir al-Husseini. So these were two separate battalions who were the main contingents of this Palestinian jihad. So the Qassam forces, they were fighting, and also the Abdul Qadir al-Husseini forces, they were fighting. So Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, he reorganized and he remobilized his battalions as well, and his army attacked British army positions in Jerusalem and on the roads between Jerusalem and the coast. So both of these contingents of the Palestinian jihad, the Qassam forces and the Abdul Qadir al-Husseini forces, they redeclared jihad in Palestine, and the fighting and the revolt restarted once again. So the Palestinians, they realized by this point that this so-called peaceful solution that the British were promising, that this was once again just another trick by the British. And the British used this as an opportunity to quell the revolution, at least for a period of time. And during this period of pause, the British, they had taken steps to retake the upper hand. So in response to the Palestinians restarting the revolt, Britain on November 11th, 1937, they issued a declaration to dissolve the Arab Higher Committee. The Arab Higher Committee was basically the Palestinian Leadership Committee. So the British, they announced a declaration to dissolve this committee and to dissolve all Palestinian political organizations and all Palestinian jihad organizations, right? They cracked down on all of this. They basically decided to dissolve the Palestinian leadership, and they exiled some of the prominent Palestinian leadership figures outside of Palestine. They exiled them, right? Now, also, during the period where the revolution was paused, the British, they were sneakily allowing the expansion of Jewish immigration during that period. While the revolution had been paused, the British, they were bringing in more Jews into the land, particularly from Europe. And they were focusing on bringing in young Jewish immigrants from Europe. And these European enthusiastic Jewish youth, they began to support Jewish military organizations within Palestine, especially the Haganah, which was the official Jewish military arm, and the Irgun, which was one of the offshoots of the Haganah. The Irgun were more extreme, and they formed their own paramilitary group, right? So these Jewish immigrants who were coming in from Europe, and the British were bringing them in during the period, during the ceasefire period. The British were bringing these people in, right? So they had their own plan. They were bringing in young Jewish immigrants. And these young Jewish immigrants were then joining these paramilitary organizations within Palestine. So look at the British. They were planning this all along. They were pretending that they would acquiesce to the Palestinian demands, but then they were bringing in these Jewish immigrants, and these Jewish immigrants were joining these extreme paramilitary organizations. And the British, they knew what they were doing. This was all part of the British plan. So now, after the period of ceasefire ended, after the Palestinians restarted the revolt, these Jews who had come in during the period of pause, they had joined these paramilitary organizations, and they had strengthened these paramilitary organizations. And after the restart of the jihad, these Jewish paramilitary organizations started their own operations, targeting and assassinating Palestinian civilians. And the Haganah organization, the official Jewish military arm in Palestine, they announced that any Jewish settlement anywhere in Palestine that would come under attack, the Haganah declared that they would protect themselves and they would fight against these Palestinians, right? Here the British, they also assigned a Zionist captain from the actual British army in England. They brought over a Zionist captain from Britain to train the Jews, to train the Jewish army, specifically the Haganah, which was the official Jewish military organization. So the British, they actually brought in their own captain, who was a Zionist Jew, and he was entrusted to train the Jewish military within Palestine. And this actually became the root of the establishment of what would later become, it would later evolve into the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala curse them. Right, so this was the root of that. The British, they brought in their own captain to train the Haganah, the Jewish military forces in Palestine. Right? Later on, that evolved into the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. All right, in 1938, Britain also established military contingents to search Palestinian houses. British soldiers going house to house, going to these Palestinian houses looking for weapons. And if weapons were found in any Palestinian house, the people who lived in that house would all be executed. They would kill the people who lived in that house. Oh, you have weapons in your house? That means you're part of the jihad. So they would kill the people of that house. So the situation continued to escalate in the year 1938. And Britain brought in more enforcements. Troops were brought in from Britain itself, from England, and also from Egypt. And a massive British operation began where they tried to suppress this great Palestinian revolution. There were night raids that were conducted by the Haganah and the British soldiers against Palestinian forces to kill Palestinian youth. There were targeted assassinations against Palestinian youth. This Zionist British captain that the British had brought in from England, he's the one who organized these night units, right? So there were repeated assassination operations that were carried out by these forces. And they also carried out assassinations in the marketplace during the daytime. So they had these night assassination attacks, and then in the daytime they would carry out assassinations in the marketplace, in the markets of Palestine. So they were killing innocent civilians. So of course the Palestinians, they responded in the Jewish markets and also in English camps and in Jewish settlements. And the British had a hard time withstanding this. So to counter this, it requested more Jewish immigration. The British called on more Jews from Europe to immigrate into Palestine. And with this, the British also requested funding from Jewish organizations. The British said, look, we're bringing in these Jews to Palestine, to settle into Palestine, but they need funding, they need financial support. So the British called upon these Jewish financial organizations to send financial support. So with this official funding and arming of Jewish organizations in Palestine began. So they began to send in money and they began to send in arms as well. So the British were now officially arming the Jewish population of Palestine. So the year 1938 was really the peak of the revolution. The number of fighters in the Qassam forces and the Abdul Qadir al-Husseini forces, by this time, it exceeded 10,000 fighters. There were more than 10,000 official fighters in the revolution. So a huge troop of the English army came into Palestine to suppress the revolution. 42,000 soldiers, along with 20,000 police officers, along with 18,000 soldiers from the colonial guard, and more than 60,000 Jews. They all tried to suppress the Palestinian revolution. There were operations that took place throughout Palestine where the British would arrest and detain Palestinian youth until the number of Palestinian detainees reached more than 50,000 detainees. Right? They detained 50,000 Palestinian youth. And in addition to the thousands of Palestinians that the British killed and the thousands that they detained, they also destroyed over 5,000 Palestinian homes. Now, the British, with their expertise in deception, and over the course of these lectures and these lessons, we have talked in detail about the British deception and how many times they resorted to deception and trickery to achieve their goals. The British, with their expertise in deception, they also, during this time in 1938, they established factions called the Palestinian Peace Factions. So they were able to get a few Palestinians on their side. They were actually able to get a few Palestinians on their side. And with these Palestinians, they formed what they called the Palestinian Peace Factions. And these locals from the Palestinians, they were not big in number, but there were a few of them who the British were able to trick. These Palestinians, they called for peace with Britain and peace with the Jews. And these Palestinians from this group, from these Palestinian peace factions, they verbally attacked Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini and Abdul Qadir al-Husseini and the Qassam forces, and they said that all of these people, they are wrong in what they are doing. This revolution should end. There is no way that the Palestinians can defeat the greatest empire in the world, the British Empire, right? So these people, this small number of Palestinians who the British were able to convince to be on their side, this so-called Palestinian peace factions, they were basically, you could say that they were the Uncle Toms of Palestine, right? So basically they were betraying their own people, and they sided with the British and they sided with the Jews. So these people who formed these groups, they were known as the Palestinian peace factions, right? But the majority of the Palestinian people, the great majority of the Palestinian people, were not deceived by this trick. And they continued their great revolution. And in the year 1939, these military operations in Palestine intensified with massive attacks and more casualties on both sides. And many Palestinians fell as martyrs, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept them as shuhada. In the year 1939, when Britain saw that the situation was once again getting out of hand, they were losing their grip on the situation, they were losing control of the situation, the British realized that no matter how powerful they were, that they could not suppress the people if the people were determined and the people were willing to sacrifice their lives, and the people were adamant in never surrendering. Right? How do you defeat these type of people? People who are not afraid to die. People who will never surrender, even if it means that they will die. How do you defeat such a people? Right? So the British, they were beginning to realize this. So when the British, they saw that this revolution had now continued into the fourth year. Now it's starting in its fourth year. 1936, 37, 38, and now 1939. It's going into the fourth year. So the British realized that this is really getting out of their hands. So the British attempted, once again, they attempted a political maneuver to stop the revolution. Right? The British, they're perhaps the most cunning state in the history of the world. Right? The deception, the levels of deception of the British state, it's something that is unmatched in history. Right? So look at what the British announced in February of 1939. What did they announce in February of 1939? They announced the cancellation of their plan to partition Palestine into two states. A few years earlier, they had said that they would partition Palestine into two states. A Palestinian state that would actually be merged with Jordan, and that's where the Palestinians would go, and a separate Jewish state. This was their plan, to divide the land of Palestine into two states, and one of those states would go to the Jews. And of course the Palestinians rejected this, and this is one of the main reasons why they resumed the jihad, why they restarted the revolt, because they did not accept this two-state solution. Right? So now, in 1939, when the British realized that the situation was once again getting out of their hand, they announced that they canceled their plan to divide Palestine into two states. And they said, we will keep Palestine as a single Palestinian state, a unified Palestinian state for the Palestinians. And they also announced that they would release the revolutionary leaders, the leaders of the revolution that they had exiled outside of Palestine. They said that we will release them from detention on the condition that they don't return to Palestine. They can go anywhere else, but they will not be detained any longer. Then it also announced a round-table conference in London with the presence of Arab delegations, Palestinian leaders, and also Jewish leaders, right? And in light of this, the revolution, it actually began to calm down a little bit again, right? The Palestinians saw that, okay, look, it looks like the British, they are starting to agree to some of our demands. They canceled their plan to divide Palestine into two states, and they said now it's going to be a complete Palestinian state, right? So the Palestinians, seeing this, they started to calm down the revolution a bit after this. So when the British saw that this plan was working, that these announcements were causing the revolution to quell down, when they saw that the strategy was starting to bear fruit, they declared a few months later, in May of 1939, the British declared that we are canceling the British policy to make Palestine a Jewish state. Remember the Balfour Declaration that they had made years earlier, where they said that a Jewish homeland, the British support a Jewish homeland to be established in Palestine. This was the Balfour Declaration. So now, in May of 1939, the British, they said, no, we're canceling this. We are not going to support the establishment of a Jewish state on Palestinian land. We cancel the Balfour Declaration. They actually announced a cancellation of the Balfour Declaration in May of 1939. And this quelled the revolution even more. The Palestinians were getting very happy to hear this, right? So when the British found out that the Arabs and the Palestinians were starting to respond to their deception, and again, it was just a deception on behalf of the British, right? But they saw again that they were able to deceive the Palestinians and the Arabs again, right? They were successfully able to start quelling the revolution with this talk once again. When they saw that it was working again, they announced their intention. The British, they announced their intention to establish a unified Palestinian state. That yes, we will allow the Palestinians to have their land and to establish their own state. There would be no partition, no section for the Palestinians and another section for the Jews. No. A complete unified Palestinian state that would be led by the Palestinians. It would be independently ruled by the Palestinians, but not yet. In 10 years. We need to prepare everything to hand it over first. So in 10 years, complete control will be given to the Palestinians, and the immigration of Jews during this 10 years, it will still go on. Jews will still continue to come into Palestine, but their numbers will be limited. So look what they're doing. They're setting the stage, right? But the Palestinians, they did not see what the British were doing. So the British announced that over the next 5 years, Jewish immigration into Palestine will not be more than 75,000 Jews. Over the next 5 years, a maximum limit of 75,000 Jews can come into Palestine. And after that, Jews will not be allowed to enter Palestine except by the permission of the Palestinians. Now look at this. They're saying these things to make the Palestinians happy. So the revolution, it calmed down even more after the British made all of these promises. The British also announced that it would prevent the sale of land to Jews. But not yet, after 5 years. The Jews can continue to buy land for 5 more years, but then after 5 years, the Jews will not be allowed to buy any land anymore. Right? So the British, they're making all of these announcements one after another, and the revolution after each announcement calms down more and more and more. The Palestinians believe that the British are agreeing to their demands, right? But now the British faced another issue. The Jews were very upset at these declarations that the British were making. The Jews didn't realize that the British, they were just playing a game. They were trying to trick the Palestinians into stopping the revolution. They were doing all of this to actually help the Jews. But the Jews, or at least some groups of the Jews, did not realize that this was just a tactic by the British. So the Jews became very upset at these declarations by the British. And they declared that they reject these agreements. And they insisted that the Jews must be allowed to establish a Jewish national homeland for themselves in the land of Palestine, right? So when the Arabs saw this, when the Palestinians saw the Jews disagreeing with the British plan, the Arabs decided to wait and see what happens here. They believed that because the Jews are rejecting this plan, the British, they will side with the Jews, right? They thought that the British would side with the Jews. And they expressed their doubts about the Jewish intentions, and they requested that the British show their true intentions, right? Whose side are you on? Are you supporting us, or are you supporting the Jews? If you're serious, you should show what you really want to do. You should make it clear whose side you are on. So in response to this, the British colonial secretary, the one who was in charge of British colonies at that time, his name was Malcolm MacDonald. He proposed the project of an independent Palestinian state. He said, we support the Palestinians. We support the building of an independent Palestinian state, but this cannot be achieved until after 10 years of allowing continued Jewish immigration. You have to wait for 10 years, then you will get your state. And during these 10 years, Jews will still be allowed to migrate into Palestine. But after that, control of the land will be handed over to the Palestinians, and then the Palestinians can prevent Jewish immigration after that if they want, right? This was the official position of the British government, as stated by the British colonial secretary Malcolm MacDonald. But it's all part of a plan, right? It's all part of a grand deception by the British. They had no plan, they had no intention of ever giving Palestine to the Palestinians, right? This was just their plan to stop the revolution, to trick the Palestinians, and while the revolution was stopped or quelled, the British would continue to play their games, bring in more Jews, bring in more of a military presence, weaken the Palestinian position, right? That was the plan of the British. So it was all a game that the British were playing. But even the Jews did not realize that this was a game that the British were playing. The Jews didn't realize that the British were doing all of this actually to help them. They thought that perhaps the British really are siding with the Palestinians. Perhaps the British really are not going to support us anymore in establishing our homeland. So the Jews became worried. And despite all of the previous planning between the British and the Jews over the years, right? They also feared British betrayal. They saw that the British were very deceptive people. The Jews saw this themselves, right? Even though they were not on the receiving end of that deception and that betrayal, they saw that the British, they betrayed everyone for their own interests. So now the Jews feared that they may be on the receiving end of that betrayal this time, right? So they feared the British intentions. And at that time, Jewish military organizations, in order to force Britain's hand, in order for them to force the British to be clear about who they really support, these Jewish military organizations continued to carry out assassinations against Palestinians, to ignite the situation, to see who are the British going to support. The Jews, they said, look, we're going to continue assassinating Palestinians, and let's see whose side the British take. Do they take the Palestinian side, or do they take the Jewish side? So they wanted to force Britain's hand to see where they really stand. The Jewish Irgun, this extreme paramilitary organization that had branched off from the official Haganah, they called for the establishment of a Jewish state, and they said that this should not be in the hands of the British. The British should not be those who decide whether we get a state or not get a state. What do the British have to do with this? They said that the Jewish state would be achieved through Jewish power on the land. They said that we don't care what the British say. We are going to establish our state with our own power, right? And they called for the forcible takeover of Palestine. They said, regardless of if we have British support or no British support, we will forcibly take over this land and we will make it our homeland. So now the Jews had reached a point of power where they no longer even paid attention to the British, right? They were pretty big in number now. The British, over the years, they had continued to bring in Jews from Europe. So now the number of Jews in Palestine had reached a number where these Jews felt that they had power and they didn't really need British support anymore. So the British then began to negotiate with the Irgun. The Irgun are saying, no, we're going to forcibly take over Palestine. We don't care what the British have to say. We don't care about the British plans. So now the British, they're negotiating with the Irgun, and they're telling them, calm down, just calm down. This is all a tactical plan that we have. We're trying to help you. Just calm down and let us do what we know how to do. We know how to play these games. So the British were trying to get the Irgun to calm down. And the Irgun, they listened to what the British had to say, and they began to calm down. But when they began to calm down, an even more extreme group split from the Irgun. Remember, the Irgun, this was an offshoot from the Haganah. The Haganah was the official Jewish military arm in Palestine. A group of extremists broke off from them, and this group was known as the Irgun. Now a group of extremists from within the Irgun, they broke off from the Irgun. So these are like super extremists. And this group that broke off from the Irgun, they were led by a man named Abraham Ashton. Abraham Ashton. And they split from the Irgun because they felt that the Irgun were agreeing to the British strategy. When the British talked to the Irgun and they told them to calm down, the Irgun agreed, okay, we will do what you tell us to do. So this offshoot from the Irgun, they didn't agree with that. They said, no, we should not listen to what the British have to say. We need to make our own decisions. So this group became known as the Ashton Organization, this offshoot from the Irgun. Very extreme. They were super extremist, right? They broke off from the Irgun and they became known as the Ashton Organization because they were led by Abraham Ashton. And they actually this organization called for waging a war against the British in Palestine. A war against the Palestinians, and also we should fight against the British as well. And they said it's not the British who decide when a Jewish homeland will be established. They're saying after 10 years, then this is going to happen, that is going to happen. No, the British should not be the ones who decide when a Jewish homeland will be established. We are the ones who will decide when the Jewish homeland will be established. So now there was tension between the Jews and the British as well. And the Jews by this point had gained enough power that they felt comfortable standing up to the British. So now the situation began to escalate in a major way. And inshallah we'll talk more about that next week bi'idhnillah. Jazakumullah khair wa barakallahu feekum. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If you guys have a car in the basement, please move it. I'm getting ready to close the basement. If you have a car in the basement, please move it. I'm getting ready to close it. Barakallahu feekum.